This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health, and Society on the campus of Miami University. In this episode, we continue our exploration of educational policy, why it's such a topic of contention among educators and politicians, and what the growing disconnect between policy and practice actually looks like inside many schools today. And here to talk with us about this subject is Dave Hile, who is not only an EHS Educational Leadership doctoral candidate, he's also currently the superintendent of Licking Valley Local Schools in Ohio. So, Dave, thank you so much for being here. As a superintendent yourself, someone who actually sees the day-to-day administration of a school district, how it unfolds, what would you say is the biggest challenge for educators when trying to manage the educational climate created by policymakers?
Well, I think it's interesting because you're calling and getting a practitioner's perspective, and to be honest with you, I think that's the biggest problem in education policy is that the politicians aren't doing that. The politicians make a lot of decisions about education policy. They're political decisions, and they're not decisions that are informed by research or the practitioners. And most of those policies end up costing districts a great deal of money. Those are the unfunded mandates. Many of these policies are unfunded mandates, almost all of them. It ends up costing districts time and effort to implement them. And then when it eventually becomes obvious that the policy is unworkable or it doesn't make any sense or it's somehow harmful to students, then the politicians reverse or revise the decisions, and then all that time, money, and effort is wasted within the school district. A good example of that is PARC. That was a few years ago. Ohio chose to join this a multi-state consortium to impose these new state-based assessments, and they were going to be, the name of the consortium was PARC, P-A-R-C-C. It's an acronym for the name of that consortium. And they spent $16 million on these assessments that were created by PARC, and they implemented them for 1 year. They were enormously time-consuming. And in fairness to PARC told everybody these tests are going to be very different. These are new generation assessments, is what they call them, and they're going to be very different than anything that we've ever seen before. They're going to be very different than anything teachers or students have ever dealt with before. They're going to be really challenging because they're going to be computer-based, and we can do things with computer-based assessments to make them more challenging than we can with paper pencil. And so they were very upfront about these are going to be much harder and much more complex assessments than we've ever seen before. Apparently, the politicians didn't believe them or listen to them. They got implemented, and they were enormously time-consuming to implement in terms of just preparing to implement them and then giving them to the students. The students, it took an enormous amount of time away from instruction to make these tests happen. Parents started realizing that their students were losing hours and hours of instruction that they weren't losing before because of these new assessments, and basically the parents revolted, and not just Ohio, but in many other states. And they started doing the opt-out. Did you hear about the opt-out movement?
Yes.
Yeah, so parents were opting their children out of taking the assessments because they were protesting the amount of time that was being required to take them and the loss of instructional time. And so after 1 year, the legislature, who had just spent $16 million on the PARC assessments, reversed the decisions and canceled the PARC assessments for Ohio. That $16 million is only what the state of Ohio paid to purchase the assessments from PARC. It doesn't include the untold millions of dollars that school districts spent getting ready to implement them and then actually implementing them. And then the untold hours of lost instruction as a result of that. So that's one of my prime examples of a really uninformed decision by policymakers that had enormous economic consequences, but it also had consequences for students and their lost learning and instructional time.
So who are the policymakers listening to? If they're not engaging and consulting teachers and practitioners, are they making it up as they go along, or or where do they get the information on how they decide what they do or should do?
Well, they have political agendas, and they have people who drive those political agendas, and so they really have lost trust and faith in educators. They think that, unfortunately, what happens is you have some school districts where students aren't learning. There's a lot of evidence that in some school districts there's just not effective instruction happening. Students aren't learning, and unfortunately, they paint every school district with the same brush. America is an incredibly diverse country with diverse cultures and diverse communities. And, Licking Valley Local Schools, which sits, 50 miles east of Columbus, is not Columbus Public Schools. It doesn't look anything like Columbus Public Schools. But all the policies that are created because of the things that aren't happening effectively in some school districts. And so all those policies rain down on all of the school districts, whether they need them or not. And so you have, if you poll the American people about what's the most important issue of the day, and what is the issue that we should be focusing our time on and dealing with, education will end up in the top 3 or the top 5 every time. Mm-hmm. So politicians see that, and every politician runs as one part of their platform is to fix education. And so it's become this political football, and when they get elected, whether they know anything about education or not, they have a mandate, in their opinion, to fix it. And then that's driven by the political cycle. So these guys are elected for 4 years or 2 years or whatever their term is, and they have to get something done before the next election cycle so that they can go back and tell the people, look what I did. And so these policies get, basically come from their political agendas. They get imposed without input because they don't have time for the input. They got to get this stuff done. And they, on top of that, they have very little respect for educators. They think educators are just protecting their own foxholes and don't really want to make changes. And so they implement these things without their input because it's the fastest, easiest thing to do.
So now, today we're in a situation where the Every Student Succeeds Act has taken over from No Child Left Behind, which is actually what we talked about with Dr. Andy Saltz during our last episode, which is basically part 1 of this podcast. So now that the Every Student Succeeds Act is in effect, Dr. Saltz talked about how that is effectively moving more power away from the federal government and to the states. So will that help fix this problem, or is that shift in power, do you see that from your perspective as a superintendent, do you see that shift in power as a good thing?
The positive that I see is that there's now a recognition by the feds that they need to leave education policy more to the states. So we had this big overreach by the feds with NCLB and Race to the Top, and we saw that it failed. And so now the feds are saying, okay, well, let's maybe reverse course here. So the pendulum is swinging back to where they're saying maybe we don't know what's best for education. Maybe we should leave those decisions to the states. That's a positive, except the states don't necessarily know what's best for education either. And so what you've got is now we have the Fed saying we're going to step back and we're going to give the states more control and flexibility to set their own education policies. But you have the states still stuck in the NCLB mindset that testing is the only way to determine anything in education. The state likes to call that local control. Local control to me, and to a lot of the superintendents that I know, is the school board in each district setting their policies, not the state telling everybody what to do. Because the state does the same thing the feds do. They set a policy, and it's one size fits all. And we have 612 school districts in the state of Ohio. They're all vastly different, and they all have vastly different needs for the most part. And so when you set one-size-fits-all policies, you affect some that may need to be affected, but you negatively impact all the others. And it costs us money. They're unfunded mandates. And a lot of it is, even though we're spending this money and our time and our effort, it's ineffective and unnecessary. So it doesn't go far enough to get the states out of our policy-making situation. And I understand 40-some%, 43, 44% of the state budget goes to education. The states are going to have a say in education policy, and they should, but it's got to be more differentiated than the one-size-fits-all approach.
So in some ways, at least there was an acknowledgement that No Child Left Behind was an overstep by the federal government, and then the Every Student Succeeds Act was like, okay, we'll give states more local control. So there's like a shift in that direction, right? So it's a start. Are you hopeful that there's going to be an even further shift to local control down the road, once people see that even maybe the states may not know what's best for local schools?
That's my hope. That's my dream. I think there's still a lot of people at the state level that want to have a lot of control of education. Again, they see it because it's one of the 3 or 5 top issues with voters, that it's something that needs to be addressed, that they see a need to have control over education, and they need to be seen as education reformers. What's happened is a narrative has been created that schools are broken. It really could be nothing farther from the truth and from the evidence. We're across this nation, our graduation rate is 80-some%. I think it's 83 or 85%. It's never in the history of this country been higher. More people are acquiring high school diplomas than ever in the history of our country. That's just one measure of effectiveness of schools. But even though we've done nothing but increase the graduation rate, and I believe increase the quality of education in public schools over the last 50 years, there's still this narrative that public education is broken, and I think it's a false narrative, but it's something that politicians run on. That the narrative I believe is a false narrative that schools are broken, but that narrative is out there, and politicians use that narrative to drive political change within the schools and to drive policy change. And so I don't see us maybe getting off of that false narrative anytime soon, even though I do think there's a lot more momentum and there's a lot more, I think, impetus to do so now among some politicians than there was before ESSA came out, the new one.
So what advice would you have for lawmakers? Are there solutions to ongoing problems that you wish they would consider or implement?
Number one, create a policymaking infrastructure that includes professional educators in the policymaking process. The practitioners have to be consulted. I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, lawmakers, and this came out of I think mostly out of the Kasich administration, they made a law that said if we're going to give tests to third graders at the end of third grade, and if they don't get a certain score on that on the reading test, then they're not going to be allowed to be promoted to fourth grade. In other words, we institutionalized grade retention at third grade in the state of Ohio. Their argument was that schools are not doing, and now again, you're painting everybody with the same brush. Schools in Ohio are not doing enough to make sure kids are reading on grade level by the end of third grade. So if the school system fails the kid, because if the kid's not reading on grade level, it's not the kid's fault. It's the school district's fault. And I truly believe that. The adults have got to do their job to get that kid reading on grade level. But some kids come in so far behind at kindergarten that we can't get them caught up by third grade. We'll get them caught up eventually, but it's not going to happen by the end of third grade. So anyway, if the kid doesn't achieve a certain score on the state assessment for third grade reading, they can't go on to fourth grade. They get retained. Now, all the research, overwhelming, there's very few things in research where you can say that the research is completely overwhelming on this point. All of the research says that grade retention is one of the worst things that you can do to a kid because you're removing them from their peer group, and it's absolutely devastating to them. Nothing good comes from it. Only harmful effects come from it. You actually hurt a student's academic progress for the rest of their career by retaining them. And here's the statistic. If you retain a kid once, they have a 50% chance of not graduating. If you retain them twice, you almost guarantee they will not graduate from high school. Okay? So in the state of Ohio, we institutionalized grade retention at third grade because a kid may not achieve a certain score on a reading test. Now, in the past, what we've done is those kids would go on to maybe fourth grade, but they would get instruction on the level where they need it to get them caught up to grade level. So that law says that they can't go on to fourth grade. There was no, so I explained that. We had a breakfast with some of our legislators, and I explained the research on grade retention and that's why I was opposed to the third grade reading guarantee. And one of my legislators, someone who was from my district, raised his hand and said, "Dave, why didn't you tell us about this research before we passed the law?" And I said, "Well, you have Google too, don't you?"
Right.
They didn't even make an effort on their own to do their own research. I was supposed to somehow come and present the research to them. But so professional educators have got to be involved in a discussion about policies before policies are created and implemented.
All right, great. And I guess, do you have anything else to add to that? Finally, really, when you get right down to it, what do you think is the best way to ensure that students receive the support and attention that they all need and deserve?
There are no policies, truly, in my opinion, that can be written at a state level or a federal level that will answer that question. That has to happen at every school district. Education is about the people that work with the kids. You have to find the best people every single time. You have to find the best teachers, the best bus drivers, the best cooks, the best aides, the best administrators. So we put an enormous amount of time and effort and energy and learning into hiring the best people. And when you do that, then you put your kids with the best people. Those people have their best interests in mind. They're high quality, highly talented people. Kids will learn and grow every day. It's that simple. That can't really be legislated. It can't be. It's something that there has to be a commitment in each school district for that to happen. But if you do that, it solves a whole lot of other problems.
Wonderful. Dave Hile, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And hopefully maybe we can talk about this subject again and revisit it in the future to see how things continue to unfold.
Great. I look forward to it, James. Thank you.